Hello everyone, welcome to the Paul Mellon Centre's Winter Book Night. My name's Sarah, I'm Sarah Turner, the director here at the centre, and it's lovely to welcome those of you who can join us on site in Bedford Square, and also a very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us online this evening. For me, our Winter Book Night always feels like the start of the festive season. It's our final event of the Paul Mellon Centre's events programme, and it really sort of kicks off that feeling of winding down into the festivities. But before we do that and wind down properly, we've got lots of wonderful talks to come. And what we're going to do is we're going to hear from our three authors and take the talks back to back, and then we'll have an opportunity for discussions and questions, both from people who are here with us in the building and also those of you who are online. I will be sent your messages and questions to my phone, so please do feel very much part of the conversation wherever you are listening to these talks from. I think the presentations that we'll hear tonight from our authors all represent both the depth and the range of PMC publications into the histories of British art. Ooh. Voices from above. And what we ask our authors to do is give us a kind of snapshot of the book. It's impossible. These books are kind of 100,000 words. They're not going to read them all out word for word, don't worry, but really give us an insight into their project. So the format really is a sort of dynamic and lively one, and it's really a chance for us to engage post-publication with these projects and hear from the authors themselves. These are projects of often many years in the making, a lot of labour, a lot of thought, a lot of kind of conversation and dialogue feeds into the making, the publication of the projects. And this is a moment for us to celebrate the authors and also have a chance to just hear from them themselves about the process and think about really what's come out of publishing these books. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our authors to you in the order in which they'll speak. So first we're going to hear from Esther Chadwick. Esther is lecturer in art history at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and her book is, here we can see it, The Radical Print, Art and Politics in Late 18th-Century Britain. This is a groundbreaking account of printmaking that explores the medium's intersection with radical politics. I'm not going to say too much more because I feel if I go on at a length, I'll give it all away. And we've only given you 10 minutes, so I won't steal all that time. But I really encourage you to have a look at the books. When we have our drinks, they'll be there for you to have a look at in more detail as well. And then after Esther, we'll be joined by Ian Dudley in the room. And Ian is a visiting fellow in art history in the School of Philosophical, Historical and Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Essex. And Ian is representing the book Aubrey Williams, Art, Histories and Futures. And it's the first comprehensive exploration of Aubrey Williams' art, revealing the cross-cultural dynamics and transformations connecting Caribbean, British and Atlantic histories. We're really proud to publish the book. Again, the format is something which was quite an experiment for us to think about, publishing essays alongside Aubrey Williams' own text. And again, that process of exploring that with Ian and also his collaborator Maradao Williams, who I think is listening to this event from Canada. So welcome Maradao as well. Again, really I think informed the book's format and thinking about how we can how these books become resources for future scholarship and conversation and community around them. And then we're going to be joined online by our author, Mark Laird, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto and former faculty member at Harvard University. And he's the author of The Flowering of the Landscape Garden and A Natural History of English Gardening. And they were previously published books, and tonight we'll be talking about the dominion of flowers, botanical art and global plant relations. And so we'll be really pleased to have Mark join us by the powers of technology. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Esther to tell us more about her book. So join me in welcoming her to the PMC.
Well, hello everyone, good evening, and firstly thank you so much to Sarah. Thank you to everyone here at the PMC, Emily, Lise, Tom, Powell, Ella and Femi for making this evening happen, but especially for bringing my book to publication. I really couldn't be more thrilled to be standing here this evening, so thank you, and thank you all so much for coming. Before I say a little bit more about how I came to this project, the radical print, which you see on screen, I thought I'd just briefly outline what the book is about so that we can kind of be roughly on the same page. I start from the observation that in late 18th century Britain, it was in the medium of print that some of the most exciting, critically engaged and experimental images were produced. Far from being devoid of invention, intellect and originality, as institutions such as the newly founded Royal Academy might maintain, printmaking was a generative, innovative, and experimental realm, which allowed artists to develop new forms of criticality, new forms of engagement with the politics of their day. And so the book tries to understand what exactly it was about print, about the medium, that made this so. Across 5 chapters, I explore the work of James Barrie, John Hamilton Mortimer, James Gilray, Thomas Bewick, and William Blake, all artists who are relatively well known in their own rights, but who are here brought together for the first time for examination in terms of what I call their critical printmaking, by which I mean image making that offered a critique of contemporary society through an experimental exploration of the print medium and print genres. By closely examining these artist prints, which, as you can see from this selection, range from large format aquatints to small scale wood engravings. The little thumbprint vignette there by Bewick is about this big. From the fizzing graphic satires of Gilray to the highly personal line engravings of Blake, I seek to show how issues germane to the medium, such as freedom, originality, indexicality, and mediation, intersected meaningfully with the period's broader political concerns, concerns that came into focus in the American and French revolutions, the Wilkite movement and other popular movements for reform in Britain, and in Blake's case, radical millenarianism. Well, our prompt for this evening included the suggestion that we might think about our project's origins and say something about how it came about. I have to confess that doing so in my case would entail revisiting a file buried deep in the recesses of my computer, dated to 2010 and ominously titled PhD Ideas. Having read over it, trust me, I will spare you the details. But somewhere in my excruciating notes, it's possible to discern the kernel of the issue that has stayed with me all the way through this project and still fascinates me now. The question of art as a form of social critique. At what point, I ask myself, did we start taking it for granted that high art or ambitious art, or whatever you want to call it, should have a critical stance of some form? A paradigm, or at least an aspiration, that I think is fair to say continues to dominate contemporary art practice in all its variety today. So I'd like to share with you 2 objects that really spurred on these questions for me. In fact, they became my bookends, forming the focus of my opening and closing chapters. The first is this: James Barrie's The Phoenix, or The Resurrection of Freedom, which in fact I first spoke about here in this building at what I think must be the 2nd ever of the PMC's now legendary research lunches. This print was published in December 1776. I don't know if you can just about make out the publication line in the lower right-hand corner. Just weeks after the American Declaration of Independence. It mourns the loss of freedom in Europe and Britain. Look at Britannia on her tomb there. But at the same time, it celebrates the rising of a new American liberty on the far shore. There she is above that temple there, rising, the American Temple of Liberty. I vividly remember first seeing an impression of the Phoenix in the print room at the Yale Centre for British Art in New Haven. It was the wonderful Gillian Forrester who showed it to me, and my jaw just dropped. I'd never really seen anything like it. You have these excoriating criticisms of England, and I'll read you one of them inscribed on the tomb, talking about the corrupt, degenerate nobility and gentry, dissipated, poor, rapacious, and dependent upon the court. But then it's a large print, this really ambitious landscape format with its classical allusions. And then the highly unusual use of a totally new print method known as aquatint that you can see creates tonal depth, a sense of liquidity and transparency, but also this feeling of kind of bubbling corrosion, this biting messiness that spills over into the border at the bottom there. What's really interesting to me is the detail of the figures on the right-hand side, where you see famous political thinkers from the 17th century, a mysterious, anonymous 18th century figure at the front, possibly Thomas Paine, and just peeping out right at the edge of the print, a self-portrait of the artist. Barry doesn't put his name to this print. That would be far too dangerous in 1776, but he does mobilize his identity as an artist and suggest that the artist's place is on the barricades, so to speak, or at least the barricades of political thought. The other object that inspired me is this, William Blake's so-called Laocoon, one of the very last prints he ever made, produced in about 1826 to 7. Blake surrounds his densely cross-hatched reproduction of the famous Greek sculpture with biting aphorisms and criticisms of commerce, empire, and war. Can you read at the very top of the print? Where any view of money exists, art cannot be carried on, but war only. Like the Phoenix, this object slips between conventional print categories. It's neither a satirical print, a religious broadside, nor a fine art reproduction, although it harnesses elements of all three of those genres. And like the Phoenix, it combines critique of the world with commentary about art itself. The fuller argument may be found in the book, but suffice it to say that through this act of remediating the Laocoon, Blake argues for the abolition of mediation itself. He uses this print to propose a form of art that is practice and prayer, nothing to do with the object at all. So I wanted to understand where these strange and potent objects were coming from, and that's what the book tries to do. What I didn't want to do, as important as this kind of work may be, was write another monograph on Barry or another monograph on Blake. Rather, I wanted to provide a broader context for the emergence of these prints. The field of print history has really exploded in the past 3 decades or so, and coupled with the extraordinary digitization work that's going on in museums, we have a much clearer picture now of the vibrancy and dynamism of early modern and 18th century printmaking. The flourishing of the English print, as Tim Clayton dubbed it in this important book here, also published by the PMC, is key background to my book. But I wanted to think even more broadly than that and situate the works I look at within what contemporaries called the paper age, in which paper money and pamphlets, newspapers, broadsides, as well as printed images, became the ground of political contestation and conflict. The artists I look at are produced by and then work with as well as against the conditions of their paper age. There was, however, a politics to printmaking itself, and that's a crucial ingredient in the book as well. Here's another one of my favourite cardinal details. Gilray is satirising here the latest publishing venture of one of the most powerful men in London, John Boydell. But what I find most fascinating is that through the detail of these two little urchins on the print's margin, he's also making a point about the relationship between paint and print, about the medium itself. The painter is barring the engraver from entry to the hallowed circle of art. So you can see that within this magic circle is the line famously inscribed in Greek over the door to the Royal Academy at Somerset House, "Let no stranger to the Muses enter here." But the engraver, with his burin in hand, points indignantly with his foot half over the line. He's saying something like, "Don't be such a hypocrite, painter. Without my work, you'd be nothing." In fact, the well-known engraver's battle with the Royal Academy to allow prints into the halls of art, while a really important part of my story, doesn't fully account for the real diversity of 18th century British printmaking as a critical practice. Nonetheless, this hierarchy of paint over print, which Gilray so piercingly identifies here, has continued to structure how we study the art of the period. I put pressure on this hierarchy and suggest that it was in print that the most advanced artistic thinking was happening. Printmaking wasn't secondary, it was a driving force of art making in this moment. My book invites us to look as carefully and deeply at prints as we've learned to do with paintings, and I hope that it will leave readers with the same sense of excitement about this material that first drew me to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our book is about the artist Aubrey Williams. He was born in Guyana in 1926 when it was still the colony, British Guyana. And he came to Britain in 1952, gave up a career in agriculture and became a painter. In the 1950s and 60s, he was among the abstract artists connected with London's New Vision Centre gallery, and he became a founder of the Caribbean Artists Movement. He was deeply involved in the art of Caribbean independence, especially in Guyana and Jamaica during the 1960s and 70s, and in the 1980s contributed to debates around the Black Arts Movement. The book has two parts. The first half is new research about Williams, and the second half is a selection of unpublished writings by Williams himself. A beautiful range of artworks, familiar and unfamiliar, runs throughout, alongside archival material and photos. I'm going to just talk about some of the images and text by Williams that I find interesting, and I'm not going to really go too much into the sort of details of the research of the book. This painting is called Heraldry at York from 1963, and you may have seen it if you've been up to the Ronald Moody exhibition at Wakefield recently, which was excellent. It's newly restored and reproduced in colour for the first time this year in that catalogue and our book. It was Williams's first major public commission arranged for the City of York Art Gallery through his friend, the actor Patrick Waddington. The interesting thing is, though it's based around York's medieval monuments, the cathedral, the abbey, the walls, the tower, and the beauty and violence associated with them, the painting clearly incorporates abstract designs evoking indigenous petroglyphs from Guyana called Timeri. Williams always described Guyana's indigenous cultures as a central influence on his work. So it gives some idea of that even in a painting that's ostensibly supposed to be connected with York in a very site-specific way, that these Guyana influences are still just as present. It's also interesting, and I picked this example, that it's from the time when Williams' work was actually rejected by Tate and such London institutions. It was regional galleries that were often a bit less parochial and more open in their outlook, it seems. This one as well, another, we can say site-specific perhaps. This is a chalk and watercolour drawing from the British Museum, and it's another example of the previously unseen artworks that we include. It gives some sense of Williams abstracting indigenous iconography, like cassava, I think in this case, in his works. He'd spent 2 years living with the Warao at Hosaruro in Guyana's northwest, which he described as his artistic awakening in terms of the organic relationship he found between their art, spiritual practices and environment. I was a bit puzzled why this was in the British Museum at all when I saw it on their catalogue, and I got them to sort of photograph it, and they were very helpful with that. But it was given by a curator who knew Patrick Waddington from the York connection, and that's how it sort of has ended up in British Museum. But it's not unfitting in a way, because the colonial collections of the British Museum are full of Guyanese indigenous artefacts of the kind that influenced Williams: featherwork, basketwork, pottery and carving. And if you've been to the Hugh Locke exhibition at the moment, you'll see good examples of the headdresses and clubs and those sorts of things. Williams is best known for abstraction of the kind you've just seen, but we also wanted to show his figurative works, including portraiture. And there's a lot of interesting examples of some of his political portraits reflecting anti-imperialist politics of the time. There's portraits of Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara and others. And it's important to note that Williams was close to Guyana's independence leaders, including Cheddi Jagan, who headed Guyana's first democratically elected government that was overthrown by Britain and the US in 1953, just at the period he was coming to begin his artistic career. This portrait was a tribute to the father of Vietnamese anti-colonialism and an expression of solidarity with their struggle. And it was supposedly gifted, I think, to the Vietnamese High Commission somewhere, but is now lost. He was close to Guyana's post-colonial literary figures as well, like Martin Carter, the poet, or the novelist Wilson Harris, who we also found some sketch portraits of. Williams was a prolific mural painter as well during the 1970s, and we showed documentation of many unseen and little-known murals of that work. He painted murals in Guyana, Canada, and especially Jamaica. He participated in an energetic mural movement that belonged to the post-colonial artistic renaissance accompanying Caribbean independence. This is the mural Williams painted at the Guyanese High Commission in Kingston, next to the swimming pool. He called it Timeri, again after the petroglyphs, and it features various pan-Caribbean celestial iconographies, the scorpion constellation, plumed serpent, sun signs, that kind of thing. We have many great archival photos, and this one's showing the opening of Williams's, I suppose, mid-career or a retrospective at the Commonwealth Institute in London. There's many interesting details. First, we see a major Aubrey Williams exhibition. There's not that much documentation of them and what they sort of look like during this early important period, including standing ashtrays next to paintings, which you wouldn't get these days. Williams is here on the right, and as Maridawa Williams writes, he never wore a tie. Eve Williams is also here, and I'll speak about her in a minute. But as this is book night, I wanted to point out a fellow author of the Paul Mellon for Studies in British Art School, hiding behind the flowers, who is the person on the left there is A.C. Suter, an old historian from Manchester. And if you dive back into the Paul Mellon catalogue for the 1970s, you'll find among the first books published are A.C. Suter's study and catalogue of stained glass by William Morris and Circle. Besides stained glass, Suter was among the early critical supporters of Williams's work and gave an interesting speech to open his exhibition here. When I began researching Aubrey Williams, Anne Walmsley, the historian of the Caribbean artist movement, said, remember, Eve was also an artist and a wonderful ceramicist. And Maridawa writes about the beautiful poetry she made in her chapter. And since among the archived photographs, there was a collection of images of Eve's pots, we wanted to include some, along with this photo of Eve working. Interestingly, both are using similar indigenous iconography, here with sun and frog symbols, which were also found in Aubrey Williams's work from this period. Okay, I'm going to move on to just talk about some couple of texts now to finish off. Williams wrote a lot of poetry, all unpublished, and we were happy to include some examples touching on early experiences in Guyana and Britain during the 1940s and 50s. One is a satirical poem where he describes his first visit to an English country pub as a Dante-esque journey into the underworld. Williams and his friend Nev are driven by the bleak winter weather into a crowded beer-soaked dive called the Blinking Bull on a Saturday night. On the door, he envisions the sign saying, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Immediately on entry, he accidentally spills the pint of a local Alf, and the rest of the poem tells his heroic struggle to fight through the rowdy crowds to buy Alf a pint before he gets beaten up. On the way, he has to bypass various dangers, racist comments, and unwanted sexual advances. At the same time, the sentimental sing-along Goodnight Irene and Mother Machree produce reflections on his own parents and childhood back in Guyana. When he enters, besides Dante, Williams compares himself to the hero of a Guyanese myth about a tribal elder who heroically sacrifices himself by jumping off Kaita Falls, which is the biggest waterfall in Guyana. So despite its humour, the text contains a poignant mixture of memories from that earlier period in the UK. Another interesting text is a record of his arriving in the UK and catching the train from Plymouth to Leicester to stay with his brother. He finds himself in conversation with various passengers en route, some sailors, a gentleman offering beer and cigarettes, and it becomes sort of a festival atmosphere. From the train, he sees snow for the first time, and his travelling companions find it impossible to conceive of someone never having seen snow before. In Leicester, Williams continues describing this first encounter with the British winter, the steam coming from horses' nostrils as they pull coal wagons through the slushy, dirty snow. To keep warm, he wears a dressing gown under his coat to the amusement of waitresses in the cafe. What interests Williams most is his first experience of a real coal fire that he sees at his brother's, and he describes himself sitting for hours watching it while it snows outside, and how snow and fire will be part of his aesthetic sensibility. Williams's paintings have a strong elemental qualities, and the climactic interests were also part of wider environmental concerns he would develop. A good example of these ecological themes is a letter to the editor about the first time he shows bird paintings in Jamaica in 1976. The critic of the newspaper, the Jamaica Gleaner, says that the works lack inherent interest, and Williams picked up his pen the same day and fired off a sarcastic response, pointing out the critic's total failure to perceive their concern with threatened species. The letter was the first time Williams wrote a response to a review, but it was effective because the critic became a very enthusiastic supporter from then on, and we're pleased that a lot of bird images appear throughout the book, and they've tended to be sort of sidelined by in exhibitions and other publications. Okay, to finish off, the last image. This one is sort of probably my favourite text and image in the book, is a portrait of Williams that accompanied an article he wrote for the magazine of the Martial Arts Society he founded along with Guyanese friends in London in the late 1970s. As a young man, he was a member of the Chinese Association in Guyana, and through it developed his martial arts practice, which he continued throughout his life in the UK. And so Williams had established this martial arts society with some friends, mainly as a self-development opportunity for young people in London. The interesting thing in the text is how it describes the style of their society as being an amalgamation of world styles from Tai Chi to Capoeira, and even being influenced by Mayan sculpture. And so it embodies an idea of a world aesthetic that was central to Williams's paintings and how we've approached the book, and in a certain sense tried to expand people's vision and perhaps depth of understanding about what constituted Williams's work. Okay, with that I'll stop, and I will just add my similar thanks on at the end to the Paul Mellon Centre, and particularly to Emily Lees for her excellent support throughout the many years of doing the project, and which we sort of couldn't done without her help, and for everyone else at Paul Mellon Centre, Tom, and also Sarah, and everyone for bringing the project forward. We've had a great time doing it, so thank you.
Mark, you have the floor. Ik kan het see you, but he can hear you.
Hi, Mark. I hope you can hear as well.
Yeah, perfectly.
Oh, we're just going to turn your sound up so we can hear you.
Just quickly putting up a slide, and it's up.
Great. Okay, Mark, over to you. Welcome to the PMC virtually.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Paul Mellon Centre and Emily Lees, for inviting me to present via Zoom, which seems fitting for a book that was generated by online research primarily and concerned with what we might call a virtual commons. Here are the first of three remarks: how the Dominion of Flowers came into being. Early in 2020, Joanna Marshner of Historic Royal Palaces emailed me with a request to join a workshop on the Imperial Garden. It was meant to involve Kew and the University of Oxford in a substantial global study, but the pandemic put an end to that. So I thought further about what I would have researched, and I began to think about plants of New Zealand in the Georgian period of Captain Cook and Joseph Banks, and in the early Victorian era of the hookers of Kew with the artist Walter Fitch. And perhaps we can have the jacket cover come up. Here will be Fitch's lovely 1850 Pahutakawa gracing the front jacket. This so-called New Zealand Christmas tree was familiar to me from London boyhood, as our New Zealand relatives invariably sent red blooming cards each Christmas. My New Zealand expatriate parents still use Maori terms such as Pakiha to refer to our relatives, what we would now call settlers. In 2017, I'd begun to think about my cousin in Wanganui and how the Wanganui River became the first river worldwide to be protected under personhood. And perhaps I can retrieve my own personhood and leave the jacket for a moment. In short, I had a global beginning along with a genealogical starting point, since a branch of my mother's family had set sail for New Zealand in 1841 from the county of Hampshire. The three-chapter structure emerged: local, being Hampshire and Dorset, pan-European, and of course, Antipodean. And I started to have fun thinking about the antipodes, English shrubbery versus New Zealand bush. Ever since researching Georgian shrubbery for the flowering of the landscape garden, and ever since replanting shrubbery at Paynes Hill and Strawberry Hill with Karen Bridgman, who joins us tonight as my guest on Zoom, I've been identified with a term of constant hilarity. Monty Python got it just right. By the way, an attentive reader of The Dominion of Flowers will not overlook an endnote on page 216, how George Eliot set a dramatic moment in the narrative of Middlemarch in what must have been the Victorian counterpart to Georgian shrubbery. In the opening lines of Dominion, I use an account of Dr. Johnson's visit with James Boswell to Luton Hoo, Bedfordshire in 1781, an account with which I'd already amused the audience at the Capability Brown conference in Bath in 2016. Boswell recalled the so-called sage, Johnson, making what he said were 2 or 3 peculiar observations. Quote, when told that there was a shrubbery to the extent of several miles, Johnson said, that is making a very foolish use of the ground. A little of it is very well. When it was proposed that we should walk on the pleasure ground, Johnson said, don't let us fatigue ourselves. Why should we walk there? Here is a fine tree. Let's get to the top of it. Going beyond Dr. Johnson's formidable contribution to the English dictionary, alluded to in my preface, I thus set up the triangle of the book's 3 Johnsons. You might guess the second PM Johnson, but the third and surprising Johnson only becomes evident at the very end of the book. So the passage I've just quoted introduces the reader to Lord Bute of Luton Hoo, Prime Minister after Prime Minister First Lord Newcastle. He was hounded out of politics. He retreated into botany for the rest of his life, helping establish Kew with Princess Augusta and producing botanical tables with the help of botanical artist John Miller. One of the two peer reviewers of my manuscript wrote, quote, "The rehabilitation of Bute is rather convincing." And botanists John Edmondson and Henry Nolte have said much the same to me in person. John Miller, born Müller in Nuremberg, published Illustratio Systematis Sexualis Linnaeus in 1777, and we'll have the jacket up again to show his pomegranate, which is represented on the back of Dominion, and with very good reason, because he's the bridging figure between the second and third chapters. These are devoted respectively to pan-European Linnaean botany in England and to global plant imports to Kew, that is, after Bute ceded control to Banks. I have it from the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography that Miller married 3 times and had 29 children. As I put it in the chapter, that was more than the 24 Linnaean classes. John Edmondson, recently updating the Oxford Dictionary claim, writes of the twice-married Miller who sired 27 children. I come now to the second of my 3 remarks. As COVID shut down everything in 2021, I was reliant almost entirely on online sources. Above all, I had to turn to the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which included the digitized version of Illustratio in the Madrid Botanic Garden. I did, of course, have a beautiful copy of the butterfly plant book, The Sema Legacy of 2005 by Wainwright and Hughes, which I'd picked up serendipitously in the bookshop in Bedminster Museum in Dorset around 2016. Dick Wainwright is with you tonight, which I welcome because he became key, absolutely key, by his publications and his high-res images to bring to life that first local chapter set in Dorset, the Seamers and Richard Pulteney, what I call after Blandford Forum, the Blandford Enlightenment. It was Margaret Riley, also my guest on Zoom tonight, who introduced me to Pulteney's Linnaean writings, which bridge chapters 1 and 2. I purchased then from Edmondson 2 volumes specific to Dorset botany, yet in a frenzy of online surfing, I found pretty much everything else I needed. The whole project would have been impossible without prior support from Amy Myers, former director of the Yale Centre for British Art, who joins us tonight via Zoom. We worked together on Mark Catesby in her 1998 book. Then she helped me to devise a brilliant vision for my co-curated exhibition at the Yale Centre, Mrs. Delaney and Her Circle. And finally, in the huge exhibition and book Enlightened Princesses of 2017, the brainchild of Joanna Marshner, Amy commissioned a contemporary work of art now at the Yale Centre. That work appears in Dominion's epilogue to signify liberation and reconciliation, which runs as a theme throughout the book. Above all, Amy had led the way tirelessly in making Yale Centre images easily accessible online. I can't thank you enough, Amy. So to the final remarks, as third in a horticultural trilogy, this book marks a polemical departure from my other books, even though all 3 are rivals in beauty. For many casual readers of Dominion, I've given them descriptive captions to the hundreds of images, and that allows for an immersion in beauty, simple beauty. Yet I trust that many will be eager to tackle the challenging texts. Some, of course, may see in Dominion a humorless, moralizing critique of England and empire. It is a bit of a critique of empire, fair enough. Yet this book is also dedicated to what I cherish in England: its gardens and natural heritage, its fine art, crafts and graphic design traditions, its literature, its humor, its people, like all those who have made the Dominion of Flowers at the PMC so appealing. I can't thank you enough. In the book's self-critiquing, a very important point, for example, in the section on the kakapo parrot in New Zealand bush, the last laugh is in fact on me, Pakeha Laird, and his shrubbery flower fixation. So turn to page 209. Meanwhile, in the climate and biodiversity crises, I'm disappointed that both Canada and New Zealand are failing Indigenous communities. Canadian federal and provincial governments thus fall under relevant criticism. But let's end on a positive note. My epilogue looks at North American foundations as counterparts to our UK trusts, arguing that private initiatives and crowdfunding can take up some slack where old-fashioned membership leaves off and where governments fail. On the 13th of November, 2024, this statement appeared in our Canadian media. Quote, 9 wealthy Canadian families and foundations are making the country's largest ever philanthropic commitment to climate action, pledging $405 million over the next decade to accelerate the shift to a low carbon economy. Moreover, as of 21st of November 2024, in Canada's Northwest Territories, 200,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Britain, are now under Indigenous management. So often it seems I turn to digital news sources and something relevant to the Dominion of Flowers pops up. I hope then that the book will still prove topical in the long run, as well as right now in the run-up to Pahutakawa Christmas 2024. Just take today's news of 80 Maori tribes appealing to King Charles to protect Maori rights against the right-leaning new government of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you very much to all of you who've attended, whether in person or via Zoom.
All use the mic, so hopefully, Mark, you can hear as well when we speak and feel very much part of the conversation. And I think your talk actually has really emphasised and brought home this global community of people relating and connecting and writing and researching under the umbrella of British art and British art studies. So I thought that's something actually for us to explore a little bit more, but just actually the very practicalities of being here tonight and all the people who are joining us online as well and being part of this conversation to hear about the books. I mean, it always amazes me actually. I just still sort of find it a kind of wonder of these kind of events that we have you, Mark, here joining us remotely, but all the other people as well, some of them who we've name-checked, who we know are here, but other people who are joining to listen in. So it's quite a wonderful feeling, actually. I think that sense of community and connection through publications and events. It's great to feel part of that and the kind of lives of publications, the lives that they generated. It's always a kind of interesting job for a chair to think about connections between what are on paper are very different projects. But actually, as I was hearing you speak, there were some really lively, vibrant themes that were coming out for me. I think one of them I've mentioned is about the sort of the international global worlds of British art, and particularly thinking about the research that's really animated the field in the last decade or so around empire and imperial histories, and how that has informed all of these books in very different ways, some of them quite obviously, perhaps others less so. Also this idea about the circulation of knowledge and access to images as well. I think particularly I was thinking in relationship to the Aubrey Williams book, making work that has not been previously accessible, putting it out there. But Mark, as you were speaking as well, talking about ways of accessing images and knowledge, and thinking about how the digital has radically transformed the field. And then Esther as well, you know, going back to thinking about print culture itself as this medium of circulation. So I think just thinking about that as this idea of circulating of knowledge, and some of the themes that were connecting your talks. And then the other thing that I was sort of thinking, mulling over as you were all speaking, is about why we do this. You know, and actually the call to, like, why publish on these authors or these artists or topics right now, and actually that call that you made, Mark, at the end about relevance and why this kind of art historical research matters in very powerful and poignant ways. And Esther, as you were speaking as well, talking about the artists, the engravers you're working on, their ability and their connection to the social critique, and their desire to be connected to the world around them and represent that in different ways. So they were just some of my sort of mulling over the incredible connections between these topics. But I just wanted to open and kind of connect us all by asking you, you've all shared the processes of researching and bringing these publications together. And like Esther, you know, sometimes that goes back even a decade or so. You know, it's years of work, and often comes from a kernel and then is developed into a book project. But what's happened after publication? And do you have other projects that are already coming out of these publications? Have there been responses that have surprised you? I'm thinking here particularly, what happens next? Because I know quite a few people in the room are interested in the process of publishing. So, Ian, tell us what's happened, and have you been surprised by any of the reactions to the book, or how is it circulating in the world?
I think people are probably still reading it and digesting it a bit.
True. It's
I
early
have
days.
started a couple of conversations about the particular with people about some of the how Aubrey Williams is framed in the book relative to previously and elsewhere, and mainly through all the stuff we're including, whether it's to do with the martial arts or the birds or other things. It was just to expand the focus, really. And then what comes next is more work, and that's why we put as many unpublished texts as we could out, and particularly interesting ones that perhaps might touch on some things that people hadn't really thought about. So just to sort of expand the discussion about Aubrey Williams a bit, and hopefully people will follow those up. There's more stuff that could be published as well, and so I carry on doing work and research, and I've got too many files opened with names on different topics, but I think just more work will continue on Aubrey Williams in that way.
Really see it as a stepping stone in research.
Yeah,
and I think it is the first monograph.
There have been exhibition catalogues before which are quite slim, and so with the essays we've got by Claudia Huck, by Julia Smith, by myself, Maridawa's chapter, Cabena's introduction, some of the other stuff that's in there, and the Aubrey Williams stuff is at a much greater length, really, and depth than's come before. And also the access to some of the lesser known archival material hasn't easily been possible before. And so, you know, Maridawa's done a great job, and then sort of following up work Eve had done as well, and then other people have done. It was a good time to bring, you know, some of that out and sort of just, if you like, make it clear that there's sort of a lot more that can be said. And it coincides with a time where Aubrey Williams is appearing in a lot more exhibitions. There's been that room at Tate, the Cosmological Abstraction Room, and Life Between Islands and things like that. So it's a good time, really, for this kind of book that's inviting people to do more to come out, really.
Great. Esther, what about for you? Is it, or was it because it's got that PhD connection? Do you feel like that's
time to move on? Well, it has been with me for a very long time. But, you know, in terms of what's happening now, and again, it's very early days. So I feel like the scholarly community is, you know, it takes a long time for these books actually to be digested and for reviews to come along.
Yeah,
or for,
true.
You know, I certainly can speak for myself in saying that it takes me a long time to read academic books. But one thing I do know is that the book is already being used to teach with. So I've got wonderful colleagues at UCL here in London who have been setting it as a text for their students in a course on printmaking, and that's wonderful to hear. So, you know, if it's enlivening the way that our students are thinking about this material, then I'm totally thrilled. And I hope that I will, you know, I'm actually on leave at the moment, and when I go back to teaching, I'm really hoping I can develop some print courses, because, you know, something that for me, the digital is absolutely crucial, because the way that, say, the British Museum has digitized every single one of its many millions of works on paper is completely revolutionized how we've been able to access and think about this material. But at the same time, it was those moments in person as a student, first seeing these objects in the flesh, that really sparked it. So you've got to keep that up too, and it's so wonderful to hear when students are in the print room looking hands-on, learning about techniques. I take my students sometimes to a printmaker's workshop and we look at, you know, how the methods unfold, because this book is I talked quite a lot about iconography this evening, but it really is about the materiality of these objects as well, and the processes and techniques that the artists are using that really informs the meaning of the works. And, you know, I do hope that the book, it's sort of joining a moment where print, it's been happening for a while now, as I said, print scholarship sort of really bubbling up and full of energy at the moment, precisely thanks to work in museums and access now to works on paper, which, despite, you know, having been some of the most public objects, the print is, you know, that thing that circulates out there in the world. Paradoxically, because of the way that they've been stored in museums, kind of behind closed doors, it's harder to go and look at prints than it is by wandering through open galleries and looking at paintings or sculptures or whatever it might be. But that has changed now because of online access. So there is this moment. I'm very excited that 2024 is also the year in which Jennifer Roberts' wonderful book, Contact, The Art and Pull of Print, which came out after my dissertation was finished. So in the process of creating the book, but it really gave me a sort of a kind of vocabulary and a sense of shared endeavor in thinking about the meaning of the kind of poetics of print in all its materiality. So I'm hoping that, you know, there might be ways that we can kind of come together in that conversation too. And
it's always quite exciting to see those conversations in print, as it were, when publications, like you say, on you know, either connected themes or topics do come out in either the same year or in succession, and that feeling that there is something animating a discussion, and then what might happen, like another event, or an exhibition making has also been very much part of your practice, and I think that's sort of the way in which the formats in which this research is communicated as well is, as you say, through teaching, through exhibition making, and like I always like this idea of the lives of books. You know, they have so many lives in people's homes, in libraries, but, you know, thinking what else might happen because someone's read something and what else it generates as well after publication. Mark, you spoke to us as well about the kind of quite personal circumstances of researching your book under the conditions of the pandemic, and, you know, being in your home study, I think it was, and the laptop and that giving you this portal onto the world, and then generating this book. And can you tell us a little bit of the process about, you know, what's happened now it's in the world and some of the conversations that have arisen after publication?
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm sort of triangulated insofar as the book came out late September in the UK, but in North America, it had to wait till the end of October. And the book launch in North America, which will take place in Toronto on the 23rd of January, still seems a way off. then there's New Zealand, and I was wondering what was happening out there. And by good fortune, Professor Nick Ross-Kruger, my Maori professor counterpart, happened to be in Toronto just 10 days ago for a UNESCO meeting. So I said, well, Nick, what's happening with my book out there in the Antipodes? And he was scratching his head. He has, of course, his complimentary copy. But I don't know how many folk out there have actually got hold of it. My cousin in Wanganui, the one mentioned in my talk, Elizabeth, did email me just a few days ago saying, we finally got your book. And it occasioned her to go out and to get the plant which is named after the kakapo parrot, the kakabeak, which is a beautiful red climbing plant, which is almost extinct in the wild. And I thought that was a rather nice moment of a book generating a gesture, reciprocal gesture. The book is dedicated to my relatives in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But I'm waiting for the penny to drop or the cent to drop to see what happens in the world.
And like Esther was saying, it does take time, doesn't it? You know, for people to either receive these physical objects or for them to be read and digested and circulated. And we talk a lot about this in our publishing team, that our books have quite a long lifespan. You know, we're interested in the impact that they have over generations. And again, teaching is on cycles of years. And then if someone's going to, you know, teach with the book on an undergraduate course, and then someone might take it into a postgraduate dissertation topic, run with an idea, that's kind of work of decades, isn't it? So, but I like that. I like thinking that they've got, this long burn. It's not all about, get them out there and get them, of course we want them to circulate, but I think also that longer kind of, thoughtful response and reflection on the work that they do. I also want to give people in the room and online chance to ask questions and join in the conversation. So please do. And if you're online, you can pop a question. I can see one already. Love it when that happens in the Q&A box, and my colleagues at the PMC are going to WhatsApp me. This is where I say I'm not just checking my own messages on my phone, because I think I'm of that generation where I still think it looks a bit rude. But this is bona fide. I'm looking at the questions coming in. But we have a question in the room, and we're going to. Oh, you've already got a mic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My question's for Ian, but I suppose it also constellates with some of Esther's research. You mentioned the exhibition that Aubrey Williams had at the Commonwealth Institute in '65. And in London, prior to that, he'd had exhibitions at Grabowski Gallery, which was set up, for those who don't know, by Polish emigres, but kind of had a focus on Commonwealth artists. And I suppose it's an anachronism, but connections between Global South artists more widely. So with respect to the fact that it's set up by Polish emigres, and also a lot of my research is about former Yugoslavia, a lot of artists exhibited there, who the constellation with Esther is that many of those artists and those works in the British Museum are actually categorised in the Africa collections because of the way that digitisation also happened, which is, again, interesting thinking about these slippery categories of Global South. I was just curious, Ian, maybe if you could speak a bit more about some of Aubrey Williams's interests or connections, if indeed there were any, with kind of Central and Eastern, Southeastern Europe.
Well, I know it's listed. One thing I've not chased down yet, but you reminded me of it by mentioning the Grabowski connection. And apart from the solo exhibition Williams had there, in '63, I think. There was a group exhibition with the New Vision Centre artists as well. And then I've seen in the museum, they've got a sort of museum of modern art in Northern Macedonia, sort of a brutalist building, I think, designed in that period. But people donated works to their collection. And I think there's Aubrey Williams And then there's Dennis Bowen, who was part of the New Vision Circle there. So there were, I don't quite know, but people donated works to this building when it was formed, and they're on my list to contact to ask about it, because sometimes I've noted works coming up, or they're listed here and there, and I sort of contact some of the museums, because we contacted the Museum of Modern Art in Ireland recently, actually, because they'd sort of listed their work for them, though it's different geography. But we'd never seen that work, so we asked, could we get a photo, and then we got a photo. So we were sort of, we haven't had all these in the book, but yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about the Grabowski show that compared to the Commonwealth Institute one, though, is there seems to be a downplaying of works with titles after Guyana themes, whereas in the Commonwealth Institute show, they're very present. So I don't know if there's some deliberate design with that Grabowski show to sort of downplay that a bit. And you get a hint of that reading some of the reviews by some of the people in the New Vision Circle, that some of them were sort of advising him to perhaps downplay that a little bit. But yeah, I don't know. Anyway, thank you.
Have more works come to light since the book's been published? Because that often happens. I know the PMC has a long history of publishing catalogue raisonné works, and inevitably once a publication is printed, and it's really that work actually of unearthing research and knowledge, but it can be frustrating as well that before you didn't know about things before publication. But has that happened much? Have you heard of things coming to light? I don't think
anyone's got in contact yet with any new things, but probably as soon as I go away, I'll remember something. But we did do a lot of trying to chase down stuff. Mm-hmm. And even, the one we've been trying to chase down the most is there were two bought with GLC money in the 1980s for the Royal Festival Hall, and they don't seem to be able to find them. So we're in discussions with them about that from the Shostakovich exhibition, the big exhibition at the Commonwealth Institute in the 1980s. So we're hoping maybe the book might give some impetus to trying to find a few lost works as well. Yeah,
I've got a comment from an attendee online, someone who's already been mentioned this evening. It's Gillian Forrester, a dear friend of the PMC and colleague to many people in the room. And Gillian says, thank you to all the speakers for fascinating presentations on their new books. These are all radical in different ways, and the act of publishing deeply researched, intellectually robust and provocative texts with superb colour illustrations and beautiful design at a moment when universities and museums are under extreme pressure in the UK and elsewhere is radical in itself. So thank you, thanks so much, Gillian, for those comments. We might have to kind of quote you on that as well. And I think it does speak to that act of publishing, and like saying why publish and why do we all do this endeavour. And so I think thank you so much for your reflections.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such a welcome remark, Gillian. Thank you, because I think the temporality of volumes of books is very different from what we mostly engage with in our lives. And I think it is in a way a radical act to, slow things down.
Slow it down, yeah.
To be forced into deep reading and deep engagement over the course of a longer text, which parallels, of course, the kind of looking that we are engaged in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I wanted to just return to collectively as well, and Mark, maybe I can ask you to kind of reflect first on this, because it was so powerfully expressed in your talk, is thinking about the global histories of British art and where we are at this moment in our field. That all of our books tonight are from very different kind of their own subject specialism. Print culture of the 18th century, thinking about botanical prints, or a 20th century painter. But I really felt a very deep connection through all of your work, and I know it as well in different ways, not just through these publications alone, but that desire for us to think, working under the umbrella or within. I can't think of another way of phrasing it, of British art, but in ways of thinking about these global connections, not just outwards and inwards or comparison, but really sort of rethinking what British art is and what it might be in the future. And Mark, I felt you were pushing us really to think about why that matters now. So could I invite you to just think with me or think with us a bit more on that?
Yeah, well, if you want to get to the bottom of why I felt I had another book to write, because the natural history was, in my own words, my final book, but here we are. There was not just COVID, but a deep unease about the climate and biodiversity crises, and then things happening in Britain, one of which would be the hostile environment. These led me to feel a desperate urge to break out of simply being a historian and to enter into the polemical field, which puts me in radical company, and I'm very happy to be there. But at the same time, I'm a traditionalist, believing that organizations like the National Trust and the RSPB, represented by my two birds here, have taken up a role over a century where government was not acting. And so the foundations that I allude to, which are now trying to make up for lost ground in terms of governmental failures, these are really important things.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's particularly interesting to think of the work of the visual, and the historians who work on the visual actually within that wider project as well. Ian, what about you, and thinking particularly of Williams's own place, position, exclusions from perhaps at some points within the narratives of British art, particularly the British modernism or modern British art, let's call it that. The terminology is not perfect, but you know, how have you been thinking through that relationship?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, because flat out I'll say whenever he was asked about British identity, he totally rejected it. And because of the colonial history and his experiences in Guyana and his experiences living in Britain as well. So you can read, if you read the published interview from 1987 with Rashid Areen, he talks a bit about that. But also I've read some other things that aren't published where he speaks around the same time and flat out rejects any label of Britishness. And he spent, a lot of time in his life in the Caribbean and working in relation to Guyana's independence and sort of post-colonial culture and trying to promote that, much to his frustration at times. So probably when I approach Williams, I kind of try and stay close to what he says and reflect that. I mean, that doesn't mean that he can't be seen within these different sort of lines of culture, whether it's British art or Atlantic culture or Caribbean art, or
I think
all of those are overlapping, and I think you'll see that in the book. But for me, really, I always want to quote Williams as much as possible on whatever topic, and he's pretty certain on his ideas.
I think this idea of overlapping histories is key. And Esther, your book isn't kind of specifically about imperialism or empire, but it's so much there, thinking about Barry and Ireland, or
it's funny because my other work has been, a lot to do with quite explicitly British art within, say, circum-Atlantic context or within global context. And this book really is about 18th century London in so many ways, and with the exception of lovely old Thomas Bewick working in Northumberland, they are artists living and working at the heart of this empire. There's a that first chapter on James Barrie and the American Revolution obviously engages directly with the question of the empire and the crisis of the British Empire following the revolution. But it is, to use a dodgy term, a kind of metropolitan focusing book. But what I think is that it's important that we continue to shine lights on and interrogate and interpret in new ways materials that we think we know, that are sort of, as it were, close to home. And I think we can do both. But absolutely, empire is there for my artists, that it's something that they can't escape from. Big questions about slavery, for example, although is not a topic that I really address in the book directly, and that's strange in a sense because it's been a really big focus of lots of my other work. But these artists that I look at come to these questions much more obliquely. So, for example, the second chapter is about John Hamilton Mortimer, and his etchings are all about the question of freedom, ultimately. He doesn't say that that's what they're about, but that's what they're about. Through this idea of caprice and the artist's will and autonomy. And so, of course, when you start saying anything about the term freedom in late 18th century Britain, you're going to be thinking about its dialectical opposite, which is enslavement. And again, I don't talk about that explicitly. It's not a huge subject in the book, but the politics of freedom are there.
Just what shape those worlds. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts, reflections? I think we have one at the back. Hi.
Bear with. This is for Ian. You mentioned briefly in your answer before that you were chasing up works, basically, and things that hadn't been seen. And I had curious prior to coming, because I'd seen, when reading the book, I got it like literally 2 days after it came out. I was really excited to see it. It's fantastic.
Got a fan, yeah.
I'm literally #1 fan. I read your the apocalyptic art essay when I was at the Courtauld, and big fan, basically. But an issue is that you can't really get digital images of a lot of his works, especially, I guess, the ones outside of the musical series. So I think a lot of which I'd seen you write about, when I kind of Googled up the image, there was like nothing. So I was quite curious, like how much had you seen, I think, in public or before the publication, and how much was new to you, knowing the title of an artwork, but seeing the image for the first time because you were doing the publication. And do you have any favorites?
Yeah, good question. Well, a lot over time I'd seen in exhibitions that have been put on, particularly at October Gallery, which is just around the corner from here, which has represented Aubrey Williams since 1984. And continues to do so. And then various public collections have put them on display at times, but he's not been on display that much. And whenever there has been exhibitions, I mean, there was a great exhibition in 2010 at the Walker Gallery in Liverpool, and the Atlantic Fire as well. So over time, I've seen quite a few, but there's still there's still works that we've reproduced I've never seen in person, but I was able to go and see some different places. And I mean, you do get given, when you get the high-res ones from the museums, obviously, it sort of has a certain, it's never quite the same as seeing something in person, but when there are these huge files and you can go in so close, they do give you something about it. But yeah, the favourite one is tricky, is really, really tricky. I at the moment, I talk about this wonderful Ronald Moody show that was up in Wakefield. They put on, as part of that, they had the heraldry at York there juxtaposed with some of Ronald Moody's bird sculptures, and it's been newly restored, this painting. It's really beautiful, and you can see he took a long time layering it, and it's an incredibly complex work, so I'm sort of hoping to do a bit more work on that, but maybe that at the moment, because of this strange, because I went to York recently as well then as part of going to Wakefield, and this strange mixture of sort of medieval influences with the Guyana influence. Again, something that I think might come forward more with Williams over time is kind of the strangeness of some of his ideas and the combinations and things that he puts together sometimes. So it's sort of certain weirder Aubrey Williams I find myself quite attracted to sometimes. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for looking at the book so closely.
And it's so nice, isn't it, when you hear that people have actually read the books?
Yeah, I mean, we send it to people like who we know or something, or who have helped, but it's really great when it's, someone...
in the wild.
Yes,
yeah, in the
it's
wild.
real people you don't know. So thank you very much.
Yeah, because it's about, you sort of saying that reviews sometimes take as long to come out as it does to actually write the book. So I think authors are often feeling like, oh, I've put all this work in, and do you like it? Don't you like it? It's hard to sometimes gauge response, isn't it? So it's always really lovely, I think, just to have connection and know that it's doing work and inspiring other people's research as well. So that's really great. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? I can see a few hands. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. My name's Dick Wainwright. I'm an entomologist, an insect person.
Oh, welcome.
But I was hugely amazed because I had no idea what to expect. And you touched on it at the introduction to the discussion of the connections between these three books. I really got that as we went along, and I was quite amazed. They are all, to me, very connected because of their radical nature. And there's an Australian philosopher, if you like to call him that, called Aaron Garr, who is extremely concerned with some of these types of issues, and also the loss of degradation of scholarship against sort of, globalization of the monetary system. But also very personal connections. I mean, with respect to the radical print, I know a guy locally where I live in Canterbury who produces radical ceramics, and I'm looking for a home for to help him find a home for some of these extraordinary things that he produces. They're not all that he produces, but he's been doing this for some years. He's won various prizes and goodness knows what else. But it's exactly the same tradition, only instead of on print, it's actually in clay. It's quite extraordinary. With respect to Aubrey Williams, you mentioned his concern over the loss or potential loss of endemic birds in Jamaica. Now, I'm wanting very much to research paintings by a man called Luke Robbins, who lived in Jamaica for many years. He was there on the money of the slave trade, but he was recording natural history, and his works have never seen the light of day. I'm the first entomologist to ever seen them in 200 years. And these document actual total extinctions that are completely unknown. So these paintings must be brought to the public attention, but they're in private hands, and there's a certain delicacy in terms of the library that they rest in. And then finally, with respect to Mark, who I'm desperately sorry not to meet in person tonight, I just draw attention to your little chapter near the beginning of the book, The Birth of Trusts and 100 Years Since the Plumage Prohibition Act of 1921. In Canterbury, where I live, roughly a quarter of the city consists of land that has hardly been touched, other than by people firing rifles, because it was a city which has huge history, good biodiversity, including turtle doves and nightingales and various rare plants. And it's a piece of military land that's being sold off. And so I'm inspired, and I'm afraid, Mark, I shall be contacting you again about a completely different issue as to how on earth we mobilise the large sum of money needed to rescue this land, because the Ministry of Defence are now selling it off to the highest bidder. And almost anything could happen to it. So thank you very much. And thank you all for these amazing works. I hope the two that I haven't got, I've got marks, are on sale, because I want them. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much again. I think it's like wonderful to hear people's connections with the books, and again across quite different subject matters. Mark, I don't know whether you've got an immediate response to how.
Yeah, I have. I actually put in a bit of money to the appeal from the RSPB on behalf of the turtle doves. So I'm right on board with Dick Wainwright, and we need to get hold of that land somehow. They would have done it over 100 years ago, so we can do it today.
Wonderful. Well, I'm just conscious of time. I want to make sure we've got time if we're on site for conversation and festive drinks and nibbles. For those of you online, I hope you will join us in spirit in that, and keep connected with the Paul Mellon Centre, our publishing programme, and all of our activities. Like tonight, many of them we try and live stream. There's an audience here for our work in London, in Bedford Square, but also as tonight is very much indicative of there's connections across the globe and audiences to connect with through events like this and through our publications, and we're really grateful. I know especially to Mark for joining us online, but we do hope that we'll see you in person in Bedford Square quite soon. And thank you so much to all three authors, to Esther, to Ian, and to Mark. It's always wonderful. I love Book Night just for that chance to kind of think a bit differently and think across projects. And again, those things that, like I said, seem quite different in title or on list, but actually, as Gillian said, what motivates them and connects them all is a desire to research, to think deeply about these subjects, but really to share that work with others so that we can all go away and be in conversation with you and to inspire future work. So again, it does feel really inspiring to do this. And I also want to say thank you to the PMC team who are here. We've got 3 members of our publishing team with us tonight. So I know people are also interested in the publishing process. If you are, we're always very happy to speak about how we do that at the Paul Mellon Centre, and tips and tricks more broadly about publishing. So it's always good to have these moments to have conversations about the publishing process, which I think we keep saying tonight is long, but is also incredibly enjoyable and fruitful as well. So we'll end it on a positive note. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's say a big thank you and let's celebrate the incredible achievement of our 3 authors who are here with us this evening. So, drinks are served downstairs. There's also a chance to look at the books, and I think we have promotional flyers where you get a special discount for the books. So do take that up.